Welcome back to HistoryGuy.com, taking the mystery out of history YouTube series on history and military conflict. So, the question here is, how many wars were fought between France and Germany? This is a question that's asked by quite a few people based on Google searches. We have a fairly popular webpage that addresses this, but we decided to make a video because, hey, an image is worth 1,000 words, right? So we're going to take a look at the wars between the German Kingdom of Prussia, which then turned into eventually the nation of Germany, versus France. And there have been quite a few, and including some of the most important wars in history, specifically World War One and World War Two. So let's get to it. So, France versus Germany. So, a lot of bad history between these two nations. There's actually quite a few conflicts prior to the creation of the Prussian kingdom in 1701. This video is not going to address those. We're going to talk about the Kingdom of Prussia onward in 1701. So, but what's Prussia? Okay, glad you asked. So, Prussia was, note the past tense, the state no longer exists. Spoiler alert. Prussia was a German speaking kingdom in north central Europe. Back in the old days, prior to 1870, Germany was divided among dozens, sometimes over time hundreds of smaller states, kingdoms, principalities, free cities, and so on, with some rather large kingdoms as well. Austria was at one point considered part of Germany, but Prussia became, over time, the most powerful of these individual German independent German states. So we're not going to get into a ton of detail on the Kingdom of Prussia, but keep in mind that this German state, with its royal family, the Hohenzollerns, became the dominant force in a united Germany in the 1870s. So again, it's a German-speaking kingdom in northern and eastern Germany. It is not a part of Russia. Prussia and Russia are separate words. They sound similar, no connection at all. Russia does have history with Germany, most of it in conflict, but that's a different story. We're going to focus on Prussia and Germany versus France here. So, again, this is a map, and we'll look at a future map here that shows how Prussia expanded its power. And this would be that map. So this is a map in the 1860s, 1870s, prior to Germany becoming united. If you notice here, we have the blue colored area is Prussia. The most of the states in northern Germany were part of the North German Confederation, which was dominated by Prussia in the 1860s and 70s. And then we had smaller but yet significant independent kingdoms such as Bavaria, which eventually followed along on Prussia's lead. So, because Prussia is considered by historians um, the let me rephrase that. Because historians look at Germany as the successor state to the old Kingdom of Prussia, Prussian military history is included here in German military history. So, for the purposes of our question of how many conflicts between Germany and France. So, here's a list of the conflicts between Prussia and then later Germany from 17 against France from 1701 to 1945. 1701 being the creation of the Kingdom of Prussia, and then 1945, of course, being the end of World War II. By our count here, let's count. We have the War of Spanish Succession, the 7 Years' War, 4 of the Napoleonic and French Revolutionary Wars that involved Prussia as an opponent of France. Then we had the Franco-Prussian War, World War I, World War II, and in between the world wars, the French occupation of the Ruhr, an industrial area of Germany. Not really a war, but it's a military occupation, so we're counting that. So, speaking of counting, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 full on wars. and we'll count the French occupation as kind of a partial. So we'll say 9.5 at this point. Wars between France against their German foes. So let's take a look at each of these conflicts in a bit more detail. So the War of the Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714, that is a significantly long war. Spain's king died with no heir. Most nations back then in the world, with a few exceptions, very few exceptions, were monarchies, and often absolute monarchies. So who the king was a huge deal. So the French king, Louis XIV, who was known as the Sun King, his basic goal in his monarchy, in his reign, was to have France dominate everybody else. So he saw a great opportunity to put a member of his family, the Bourbon family, on the Spanish throne, creating a huge Franco-Spanish empire. Keep in mind, Spain back then controlled part of the Netherlands in Europe, a good chunk of Italy, the Philippines, and a huge empire in Mexico, from basically Mexico on down south to Argentina. A huge, huge empire. Most of Europe saw this as a bad idea. Having the Sun King in charge of all that, because no one believed that Spain would truly be independent. So Prussia joined against this anti-French Grand Alliance, along with the British, the Dutch, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, and a few others. Long conflict, and the gist of it was at the end, the Louis agreed no uh, uh, connection, no permanent joining of France and Spain. So overall, he got his relatives on the throne, but they were separate officially. So that leads us to the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. This is sometimes referred by some historians referred to as World War Zero, because it really was a global conflict, largely because of the French versus British component. Both had global empires. Um, and interesting little tidbit here, the war actually between the British and French began 2 years prior in North America, when a British colonial officer by the name of George Washington led some British troops out into the forest to try and challenge the French and got in a battle. So the British and French were fighting a couple of years prior to the outbreak of conflict in Europe. And that conflict began when Prussia invaded another German state named Saxony. So we end up with two big alliances: Prussia, Hanover, which is a German state which is also ruled by the British king, and the British, versus France, Austria, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Saxony, and a few others. Huge, huge conflict. And the Prussia had one of the best armies in the world at the time, possibly the best. That's how they were able to survive against all these opponents. Plus, the British had pretty much control of the sea. Major war, but in the end, no real territorial changes in Europe. Again, huge war, no significant changes. Um, in America, though, the British captured Canada from France, which was a huge deal and had a part in leading toward the American Revolution. Another story again, but again, a significant war here. Then we get to the French Revolution. So basically, the French had a revolution, overthrew their king, eventually cut off his head with a guillotine, and the other European monarchs saw this with horror and it's like, we do not want to have a revolution. They put pressure on the French. There's a war. A war began, and it's basically Prussia, Britain, Austria, and others against revolutionary France. So these French Revolutionary Wars, combined with the wars of Napoleon, who became the ruler of France eventually, those combined have the title of coalition, the wars of the whatever coalition. So the first coalition, second coalition, the coalition, of course, being the alliance of states against France. So this first war of the coalition didn't go well for the Prussians. They were in it from the beginning, fought a big battle against the French at Valmy. Technically, it was a draw, but the French withdrew, or excuse me, the Prussians withdrew from the battlefield. French victory, in effect, the Prussians realized, okay, we don't want to be part of this anymore. Then they made a separate peace with the French in 1795. Um, Actually, the fighting had kind of stopped earlier between them. So um, the war ended eventually with France gaining some territory and the revolutionary government in France surviving, which is a huge, huge deal. So Prussia sat out the second and third wars of the coalition, but in 1806 they joined in on the fourth coalition, which was a bad idea. So the because Napoleon is considered one of history's greatest generals. He had a huge army, and by this time the army was very well experienced, a lot of veterans. They were used to winning. So Prussia joined in this fourth coalition, which includes Britain, Sweden, and Russia, against Napoleon's new French Empire. Napoleon having taken over control of France earlier. So, total defeat for Prussia. Prussia is occupied by the French army. They're then forced to become an ally of France. And then when we get to 1812, Prussia is forced to contribute an army to the French invasion of Russia. Didn't go well. But a lot of Germans, Prussians and other Germans, were extremely resentful of basically being controlled by Napoleon and the French, which will lead us to when this War of the Sixth Coalition occurred, 1813 1814. Germany today considers a war of liberation, and it was considered that at the time as well. Prussians and other Germans. And here's where Prussia starts to assume leadership of the smaller German states. So Prussia regained its independence. The a huge alliance of states then defeat Napoleon, defeat after defeat after defeat. Paris is eventually occupied. Napoleon surrenders, goes into exile. Everybody's happy except Napoleon, of course. So, and the French royal family, the old Bourbons, are put back in power because they're considered to be not as dangerous as Napoleon. And by this time, the alliance was really looking at Napoleon as the enemy, not necessarily the French nation, because they wanted France to become part of the family of nations again. Well, that's a great story, except Napoleon didn't read the script. He returns. He escapes exile, regains power in France, and the Allies are now determined to end him for good. So the old coalition reforms, armies are marching, and at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon and his French army meet the British and other allied nations. We have Belgian, we have Dutch troops. The Prussians are marching in, and it's it's a very dramatic battle. And Napoleon is almost at the point of defeating the British when the Prussians arrive. And so the British General Wellington, very famous general, later admitted, hey, yeah, without the Prussians coming in, we may not have made it. So Prussia had a huge, huge part in this victory over Napoleon. He's defeated, goes in exile again for good. Prussia earned a spot at the Congress of Vienna, which is the winning nations of Europe coming together to redraw the map of Europe, decide what's going to be done with France, and their decisions help lead to more or less a relatively peaceful time in Europe for the next 80 to 100 years. Well, until the French and Germans go at it again, anyway. So they set up a system that more or less worked, and the other nations of this Congress, this grouping of major nations, make a lot of decisions for a lot of smaller nations, which may not be good for the small nations, but it did generally keep the peace until it didn't. So, which takes us to the Franco-Prussian War. So, Prussia became more and more of a leader of the German states, and under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, who was working, for the Prussian king, Prussia engaged in a series of wars with Denmark in 1864, with Austria in 1866, and then France in 1870, that resulted in the unification of Germany under the Prussian king. So, in a dispute over whether the German prince would become king of Spain, there's Spain again. The Prussians under Bismarck basically tricked the French Emperor Napoleon III, yes, another Napoleon, into declaring war on Prussia. Bismarck was very, very clear. He wanted the other side to be the, quote, aggressor. And even though France, quote, started the war, the Prussians were ready. And so they immediately mobilized, not just themselves, but all the German states, minus Austria, who they had defeated earlier, into invading France under Prussian leadership. So, in a series of decisive battles, the French army is forced to surrender at Sedan on the Belgian border. Complete defeat of France in this battle. The Emperor Napoleon III, who is the nephew of the first Napoleon, by the way, surrenders. He is then overthrown in a revolution back in Paris, and France's Third Republic begins and decides to continue the war with the Germans. And there's a French Civil War in there also, again, outside the purview of this video, but huge, huge changes for France. And this picture, by the way, shows Otto von Bismarck and Napoleon III after Napoleon is captured at Sedan. And that sword being held there, that is by the German, is the French Emperor's sword. So, yeah. Hey, dude, you lost. So, aftermath. Huge, huge aftermath here of this war. France now has a new Republican government. Germany is united, and as a single nation, the German states decided to become the Germany, one single country, under the rule of the Prussian king as a new Kaiser or Emperor of Germany. France lost the border provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany. They had to pay a huge war indemnity to Germany, 5 billion francs, and partial German occupation of France until the payments are complete. France paid it off as quickly as they could, early actually, to get the Germans off their land. This is a major reason France and Germany went to war again in 1914, which then became World War I. So France is humiliated. And not just the loss of land and the money and the fact they lost the war. Little things like this picture here shows the Prussian king being proclaimed Kaiser or Emperor of Germany. And this took place in the French Palace of Versailles, which is where French kings traditionally had been coronated. It's like a real in your face, hey, you not only lost, we're going to proclaim our emperor in your old king's palace. A lot of bad blood here. And both sides are now, no, there's going to be another war. And they're both preparing for it. And so France and Germany, then engage in finding allies to help them in the future war. France makes friends with Russia, which, if you look at this map, just happens to be on the other side of Germany. Germany makes buddies with Austria-Hungary. And because of a lot of other internal and external politics, Austria goes to war with Serbia in 1914. There's a whole other story there. We won't get there. Russia then was an ally of Serbia, starts to mobilize. Germany says to Austria, we have your back. And France, being an ally of Russia, then says, hey, if there's war, we will be in it too. And then, boom, World War I. There's a lot more detail to that, but that's basically it. And one of the main centerpieces here is the German-French rivalry, stemming largely from the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. So, 1914, the Great War began, later called World War I. Most destructive war in history, up to that point, ended in total defeat for Germany and her allies. The German monarchy fell in a German revolution. Germany was forced to sign the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, which took away large chunks of their land. They lost all their overseas colonies. And they had to pay a huge war indemnity as well. And they also, other indignities from the German point of view. They were, could not have an army larger than 100,000, all kinds of restrictions, way beyond what you normally see imposed on a defeated nation. So all this German humiliation, anger over that treaty and what happened after helped bring Adolf Hitler to power in 1933. So again, the seeds of the future war are laid in the peace of the previous war. And in between the two world wars, but related, the French and the Belgians occupied a part of Germany called the Ruhr for a couple of years. And in the 1920s, Germany had an economic collapse, couldn't make the payments on the war debt. France and Belgium, who were more than happy to stick it to the Germans, occupied probably the most economically viable part of Germany at that point, to force them to pay up. And so German anger over this invasion also added to Germany's turn to the right toward extremist politics of people like Adolf Hitler. He keeps popping up here. This picture shows a German civilian um, being confronted by French troops. So, not an actual war, but it was an occupation by military forces. About 130 Germans died in various protests. Again, this helped foster the environment that extremists like Hitler could use to gain power, which he does in 1933, and immediately begins rearming Germany, plotting to regain lost land and power, which he described everything he's going to do in his book, by the way. If anyone had bothered to read it and actually act on it, they would have known what he's up to. So basically, Hitler seizes Germany and Czechoslovakia. Austria and Czechoslovakia. Austria becomes part of Germany again after being kicked out in 1866. Then Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939. Again, a lot more detail available there, but for our purposes, that then leads France and Britain to stand by Poland when they didn't stand by Czechoslovakia earlier and declare war on Germany. The war has begun again between France and Germany. But in May 1940, Germany invades France, conquers their old enemy, kicks the British army out of France as well. And here's a map that shows how Germany divided up the spoils, so to speak. They occupied northern and most of western France. Southern France was basically under the control of a puppet government set up by the Germans, or allowed by the Germans, set up in the city of Vichy, referred to as Vichy France, the Vichy government. A lot of French people resisted both Vichy and the Germans in partisan guerrilla warfare, as well as um, the Free French military forces who had escaped to to Britain, excuse me, and they are under the leadership of General Charles de Gaulle, who would later become the leader of France. So they continue to fight from exile. June 1944, the Allies invade northern France to liberate them from the Germans. And in August 1944, Allied troops and Free French troops liberate Paris from the Germans. Germany eventually surrendered in May of 1945. Again, total defeat. And this time, unlike with the First World War, where Germany was not occupied militarily, all of Germany is occupied by the victorious Allies, and at first divided into different occupation zones. You see here on this map as a British zone, a Soviet, Russian zone, American zone, French zone. And Old Prussia, that territory to the east is kind of a pale yellow, was taken from Germany and divided between the Soviet Union and Poland. And modern day Poland and modern day Russia still control those territories. The German people who live there basically were forced to move into Germany proper. Um, so, this division, though, helped set up the Cold War. Again, the seeds of future wars are planted in the ending of the previous wars. So, the Cold War is a whole other big thing. Germany was divided. The eastern part was part of the Soviet bloc. The western part became part of NATO. Both became independent nations, West Germany and East Germany. They were their popular names. Um, West Germany became a democracy, East Germany a communist dictatorship, and the West Germans became strong allies of France and the other Western allies as part of NATO. And then eventually the Soviet Empire collapsed. East Germany agreed to union with West Germany under the West German government. And so today, modern Germany is a united nation under the democratically elected government of Germany, and is now a strong ally of France, of Britain, of the United States. Basically, part of NATO, a huge part of NATO, part of the United Nations, part of the European Union. There's really no conceivable way at this point anyone can really look at Germany and France and say there's going to be another war. by being totally defeated and having their entire culture, political culture, changed into a democracy. Germany is now a strong member of the family of nations. So there you have it, folks. This is a short rendition of the many conflicts between Germany and France. And if you like this, please subscribe to HistoryGuy.com State of the World YouTube channel. We are hoping to create more videos along these lines. And um, also, you visit our website at historyguide.com for more great content. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you in the future with more videos where we take the mystery out of history. Thank you.